When investigators opened the small cardboard box left on a public library shelf, they expected another taunt, another riddle, another impossible clue. But what they found inside that box changed everything. Because the murderer who had slipped through their fingers for nearly 30 years had just made the biggest mistake of his life. A mistake so small, so ordinary, that no one could understand why he made it. If this story shook you from the very first moment, make sure to subscribe and click the bell to Cold Case Secrets, where we uncover the truth behind the world's darkest mysteries. For decades, Wichita, Kansas lived under a shadow. Not the kind cast by storms or fading factories, but a shadow created by one person. Someone who hunted quietly, methodically, and without remorse. The killer called himself BTK's shorthand for bind, torture, kill. A name he chose deliberately, almost proudly. A name he signed on letters, tucked into packages, and mailed to newspapers like a ghost reaching out through paper and ink. But the people who lived through his reign of terror rarely said his name out loud. It carried weight, fear, grief, confusion, and a strange kind of disbelief that one man could do so much damage for so long, all while pretending to live an ordinary suburban life. This story stretches across 3 decades from the early 1970s into the 2000s. It's a story of grief that never healed, detectives who refused to give up, and a killer who believed he was smarter than everyone around him. He wasn't. And in the end, he left a clue that no one expected, a clue that cracked open the truth and brought one of America's most infamous serial killers to justice. But before the discovery, before unraveling, before the mistake that finally exposed him, the story began with a family who opened their door on an ordinary morning, completely unaware that their lives were about to become part of a nightmare Wichita would never forget. It was January 1974 when Wichita first met the man who would become BTK. Most families were settling into the new year. Snow still covered parts of the city. Neighborhoods were quiet, and families were returning to their routines after the holidays. But inside one modest home, something unthinkable had happened. Investigators who stepped inside that house still speak of what they saw with a kind of haunted clarity. It wasn't just a crime scene, it was a message. Someone had planned this. Someone had studied his victims. Someone had taken his time, and someone had left nothing behind that could identify him. No usable fingerprints, no footprints, no forced entry, no connection the police could trace. In those early days, detectives combed through every detail, every object, every corner of the home, but the killer had cleaned up with unsettling precision. The scene felt staged, almost like the killer wanted the investigators to see his capability, his control, his brutality. In the weeks that followed, Wichita struggled to process what had happened. The victims were known in their neighborhood as gentle, good-hearted people. They were the kind of family others waved to in the morning. The kind of people who never caused trouble, never made enemies, never imagined they were being watched. But they were, and this would not be the last time. The killer had found what he was looking for, not just victims, but a feeling, a sense of domination and thrill that he would chase again and again. And soon, he began to crave recognition. He wanted his work to be seen. That's when the clues began. Months passed after the first murders. Public fear began to soften. People wanted to move forward. Then, in October that year, a letter arrived at a local newspaper, typed, carefully structured, written with a cold, unsettling confidence. The writer claimed responsibility for the murders. He described details known only to the investigators and the killer himself. He made it clear he wanted attention. He wanted a name. He wanted the world to know he was watching. It wasn't just a confession, it was a warning. Inside police headquarters, detectives sat in stunned silence as they read the letter. The precision, the pride, the obsession with the murders. It all felt rehearsed, controlled. There was no apology, no remorse, no humanity. This was the first time the killer called himself BTK. That letter marked the beginning of a decades-long nightmare. And the clues didn't stop there. Packages began appearing around the city, hidden in public places, tucked behind signs, left in parks. Each one is carefully prepared. Each one contains chilling descriptions, sketches, or objects connected to his crimes. The killer was revealing himself piece by piece. But none of the pieces pointed to a name or face. Instead, the clues only deepened the mystery like puzzles designed to mislead, frustrate, and taunt the very people trying to stop him. Wichita stopped feeling safe. Families locked their doors during the day. People looked over their shoulders while walking to their cars. Women changed their routine, swapped shifts, and bought extra locks. For the first time in years, the city felt small, too small for the fear contained within it. But the killer continued, always watching, always choosing victims who seemed unrelated, unpredictable, and impossible to profile. And each time, he left behind only what he wanted the police to see. Clues without direction, trails that led nowhere, threads that frayed before they could be tied together. BTK was not just killing. He was performing. By the early 1980s, the case had consumed hundreds of hours, dozens of detectives, and countless resources. But the killer had vanished. No more letters. No more packages. No more murders attributed to him. Wichita didn't know whether he'd move away, been arrested for something else, or simply lost interest. Some people dared to hope he was gone forever, but the investigators never closed the door on him. They kept boxes of evidence in temperature-controlled rooms. They ran new tests as forensic technology evolved. They tracked down leads even when they seemed ridiculous or impossible. Every detective who worked the case understood the same truth. BTK wasn't finished. He was waiting, and they were right. 25 years after his first murders, long after most serial killers would have been caught or identified, something strange happened. In 2004, a local TV station aired a story asking whether Wichita's infamous serial killer might still be alive, whether he had simply moved on, whether the city was safe. What happened next shocked everyone. BTK came back. In March 2004, a letter arrived at a local newspaper. The same tone, the same style, the same cold pride. Inside the envelope was a copy of an item connected to a long unsolved disappearance. The killer was confirming his involvement as secret investigators had long suspected but could never prove. It was him. After 25 years of silence, BTK had returned as if no time had passed at all. Over the next several months, packages began appearing across Wichita again. Some were left on a stop sign. Some were placed in parks. One was even hidden inside a cereal box and dropped into a pickup truck. Every package contained puzzles, letters, or photographs. Every message was a new taunt. The police worked around the clock. They analyzed paper, ink, postage, handwriting, and every microscopic trace of DNA. They ran the letters through forensic linguistic software. They cross-referenced phrasing, grammar, and misspellings with tens of thousands of documents. Nothing stuck, but BTK, now older and growing overconfident, wanted something he had never had before, a conversation. So he asked the police a question, one that would become his downfall. He asked if a computer disk could be traced. Investigators, careful not to spook him, responded publicly through a newspaper ad. They told him no. They told him it was safe. And he believed them. Weeks later, a small cardboard box appeared at the downtown library. Inside was a purple floppy disk, along with more documents and messages signed with BTK symbol. Investigators inserted the disk. What they discovered stunned them. A digital fingerprint, a trail hidden in the metadata. A clue BTK never thought he'd leave behind. The disk had been last accessed at a church computer. The registered name on the file was simple. It led to a man who had been living quietly in the community for years. A husband, a father, a church leader, a neighbor who seemed patient and polite. That name connected all the dots that had taken decades to assemble. But investigators couldn't move yet. They needed more. They needed something irrefutable. So they watched him. They followed him. They dug into his past. And finally, they collected a DNA sample from a family member. Something legal, something discreet, something that would either confirm or destroy their theory. The results came back. A near-perfect match. The killer had been hiding in plain sight. The man behind the mask wasn't a drifter. He wasn't someone with a criminal record. He wasn't someone the neighborhood feared. He was ordinary, quiet, structured, methodical. He held a stable job. He volunteered. He had a family who had no idea what he had been doing in the shadows. He had walked past detectives in grocery stores. He had attended community events about his own crimes. He had studied his own case in newspapers, as if he were a spectator to someone else's story. But the truth was now undeniable. The killer who had taunted Wichita for decades had finally revealed himself not through arrogance, not through violence, but through a piece of technology he believed was untraceable. The clue he thought was harmless had become the key that unlocked everything. And when officers finally approached him, the city held its breath. Families who had waited for answers felt a quiet shift of fear turning into relief, grief giving way to truth, and decades of unanswered questions being lifted at last. But even after the arrest, even after investigators confronted him with evidence, photos, letters, DNA, and decades of pain, it wasn't over. Because BTK wasn't done talking. And no one was prepared for what he said next. As investigators dug through his home, garage, and storage areas, they uncovered journals, photographs, trophies, sketches, plans, and more details than anyone ever expected. Every detail was documented. Every crime was cataloged. Every fantasy was preserved. It became clear that the murders were not random. They were hunted, planned, executed with chilling patience. His family, blindsided and devastated, struggled to understand the truth they had been living beside for years. The community, once frozen in fear, now found itself frozen in disbelief. And investigators, though relieved, carried a heaviness that came from knowing how close they had been at times and how far they had remained. The trial revealed everything. The preparations, the stalking, the control, the manipulation, the fantasy-driven motives. There was no remorse, no apology, only explanation, cold, clinical, and detached. He received the maximum penalty allowed by Kansas at the time. And while justice brought closure, it could not erase what had happened. But for Wichita, the truth mattered. It closed a wound that had been open far too long. Still, not all questions were answered. Not all secrets were uncovered. Not all clues were fully decoded. And investigators who worked the case began to wonder if the story was truly finished. Because even after all the files were opened, all the evidence analyzed, and all the confessions recorded, one detail, one discovery hinted that the final chapter of the story had not yet been written. Some stories end with justice. Others end with silence. But this story still lingers in the city that lived through it. Some investigators believe there are still unsolved pieces, unexplored clues, forgotten threads, hidden connections waiting to be uncovered. Some believe he left more behind than anyone realized. Some believe part of the truth is still out there. And in a locked evidence room, deep inside Wichita's police department, sits a box one the public has never seen, one that was discovered long after the arrest, one containing items that don't match any known crime scene. Items that raise questions no one has been able to answer. Questions that hint the story isn't finished. Not yet. Part 2 is coming. Thank you for watching Cold Case Secrets.